Hey makeup friends, before we get into this video, we need to address the elephant that is currently living on my face. Yeah, it's a cold sore. I have done my best to conceal it, but also I don't want to put a ton of makeup on it, so just don't make direct eye contact or you might turn to stone. All right, with that out of the way, let's get into this. As always, I want to start off by welcoming you back to my channel, or if you're new here, then hello and welcome. My name is Kara, and today we're going to be taking a look at this itty bitty little palette here from Pat McGrath. It's adorable, it's tiny. I'm going to give you the information that you need to decide if this is something that you need in your collection. So it is a limited edition palette. It retails for $38 Canadian or $29 US. There are 6 shades inside. 5 of them are repeats from her larger full-size palettes. 1 of them is new. I will get to that in a moment. But first, I just want to quickly take a look at the actual packaging itself, because when this picture went up on Trendmood, there was quite the divide in the comments. Some people thought it looked cute, some people thought it looked really cheap. I'm here to say, now that it's in my hand, I really don't have any complaints about the packaging. I mean, I have to say, I'm glad there's nothing gimmicky about it. It's a nice solid plastic packaging, not too fat. It's obviously not too big. I mean, it's tiny. It's got this nice gold embellishing on it, information on the back, including the shade names in a way that it's actually very easy to read. And then it just opens up and there's a full mirror inside, and then the 6 shades that you see right there. This shade here, called Sunset Bronze, that is the unique shade. The rest of them exist in previous palettes, and I'm sorry to say, but I was not dedicated enough to go hunting through all of her existing 10-pan palettes to figure out which one each of these shades comes from. Suffice it to say, if you have any of the large size palettes and you're concerned about spending money on a palette that may have more than one repeat, do your own due diligence, look at the names of the shades that you have, see how many of them are replicated here, and decide from there. Now, one thing I will say is that on the Sephora website, it describes this as being a user-friendly layout, and it's not a unique layout. It's shades laid out side by side in 2 rows. That's nothing novel. We've seen that a bunch of times, so I find that description of a user-friendly layout to be weird, because aren't they pretty much all, unless they're in some weird configuration? But regardless, I'll let it slide. It's neither here nor there. Let's talk about the size of this thing. So I've done a little bit of math, I've broken some stuff down, and I have a few comparisons to show you. So let's get into that. So in each pan, you're getting 0.5 grams of product for a total of 3 grams of shadow in total. Now, by way of comparison, I do have a mini Natasha Denona palette here. This one has 0.8 grams of product per pan. And then I also brought out this guy here from Viseart. This is the Paris Etoile palette, which by the looks of it, I still haven't used despite buying this in December, the second it dropped, but that's a regret for another day. Apparently, and I find it hard to believe because the pans are so small, but it says this has 8 grams of total product. There are 8 pans, ergo 1 gram per pan, even though they look tiny. So with that, particularly looking at the Natasha Denona comparison, this is 0.5, this is 0.8. They're not so small that it's absolutely ridiculous. And honestly, I think the size of these pans is something that you have to take into consideration for yourself. Now, I can't make the decision for you as to whether or not something as small as 0.5 of a gram of product per pan is appropriate, or whatever the word might be, is enticing, is good, is bad. I can't pass moral judgment on it. Some people are going to love that because at least you have a hope in hell of actually getting through one of these shadows. Some people are going to view it as a waste of money. It's up to you to decide which camp you fall in. For me, personally, because I have 6.5 million eyeshadow palettes, I actually really appreciate the small size. And I will say, because there is such a small amount of product in there, I am very glad to see the rectangular shape, because if these were just little tiny circles, you might have a hard time getting a fluffier brush in it. In applying this palette, I have not encountered any of those issues whatsoever. Now, to put a little bit of context around like the value of the palette, I took a look at her 3 different palette sizes and figured out the cost per gram for each of those different sizes. So I've done them in Canadian because I am Canadian, and I have to look down because I cannot recall these numbers off the top of my head. So for the full size 10 pan palette, of which I own 0, they cost $174 Canadian before tax. We'll just leave the tax alone. So $174, there's a total of 13.2 grams of product in them. So per gram, you're paying $13.18. Then we move on to like the midi sized palettes, which I've got one of them here. This is the Bridgerton, the first iteration of the Bridgerton palette. So this has 6.6 grams of product in it, and the palette cost $86 Canadian, which means it's $13.03 per gram. Then we look at this little guy. Now, the trend typically is when you're paying for minis, you're paying a ton more per gram than if you just bought the full size. I'm thinking in specific like the ambient lighting powders from Hourglass. Yes, the mini costs less, but you're actually paying far more per gram than you would if you bought the full size. So that's what I expected to see happen here. So this is $38 Canadian. There's a total of 3 grams of product in there, meaning you're paying $12.67 per gram. So from a value perspective, cost per gram, this is actually the way to go. The value is there by comparison to other Pat McGrath palettes. Of course, if you compare a mini palette from a less expensive brand, it's going to skew the results, so I just stuck with the Pat McGrath ones. Okay, so now that we have talked about the economics of the palette, let's actually see this thing in action. So let's start off with some swatches. Now, I did look for actual shade descriptions on the Sephora website. There was nothing listed. I looked for the palette on the Pat McGrath website. It wasn't there, which leads me to think that this is actually a Sephora exclusive, but I could be wrong on that. Don't quote me. However, as a Canadian, I've said this before, I am not going to be buying from the Pat McGrath website again anytime soon. I've just had really bad interactions with their customer service and with their shipping, so I prefer to wait for it to hit Sephora in any event. So, as we can see, there are really no issues in terms of swatching these shadows out. Did have to build up that darkest purple a bit, but having said that, it does build up nicely, so I really can't complain about that. Where I think this palette shines is in the metallic finish. I just love a nice, smooth, foiled shadow that almost feels creamy at its core, and that's what this delivers. So very happy with those two. Now, in terms of the actual eye look, I'm just gonna scoot on over here so I can just throw some footage up here as we talk. I have now been wearing this on my eyes. What time is it? It is 8:30 at night, so I've had this on for about 12 hours. And if I take a nice close look at what's going on, I can see there is like a tiny little bit of transfer of some of the glitter down onto my cheeks and down under my eyes, but really nothing to write home about. Like, as you can see, I have to get this mirror pretty darn close to my face to see it. There is like a little bit of creasing, but I get that with pretty much any shadow to begin with. I really appreciate that that dark shadow is still showing up really nicely. I had put one of the more metallic shades underneath my eye, and I'm still seeing that metallic finish reflected there. The glittery shade is still glittery despite having lost a few of them throughout the course of the day. And honestly, more surprisingly is like, at least on this inner corner here, some of that is still showing up. Before I sat down to film, I didn't touch up my eye makeup at all because I really wanted to see how it held up over 12 hours. And I think it's holding up really well. There is some fading over here in this corner. I do have deep set hooded eyes, so there is a lot of friction there throughout the day. I'm not surprised to see that. I really can't fault the eyeshadow for it. When my eyes are open, it's not nearly as noticeable as when I'm like stretching and looking the way I am right now. So really nothing to complain about at all. Everything has sort of kept its own color so I can see this was the lighter purple, this was like the brighter, more metallic purple, this is the darker out here. It hasn't become one like amorphous blob of color and become really muddy or gross looking, so I think it's held up really well throughout the day. In terms of the actual application of it, the two matte shadows in here, I was honestly a little bit concerned that they were going to be too deep, but they don't go on full pigmentation, and that's not to say that they're patchy or difficult to work with, it's that they're buildable, and I do appreciate that, especially when you have a very limited selection of matte shadows to choose from, because it gives you more range. So instead of requiring one really light shadow and then a mid-toned and then a deeper one, they kind of act like whatever gradient you want depending on how much you build them up. So from that perspective, it's a lot easier to work with than I thought it was going to be. So I'm happy about that. The only shadow that I would say absolutely needs some assistance is this sparkly purple one here. That's what I have over the center of my lid. As you can see in the video footage, when I applied it dry, it just gave a really sheer wash of color, which again, some people might really like that. I wanted more full impact, so I went in with some setting spray and that did the trick. So I didn't find it frustrating at all. It picked up really nicely with the brush. If you want that nice sheer wash of color, it lends itself to that, which is also really nice. Again, when you have such a small selection of shades, the more versatile each shade is in and of itself, the more versatile the palette on the whole is, obviously. So let me just round out my thoughts here. One, I'm not offended by the price point for it. It is Pat McGrath. She does have higher price points, so if I can get a palette from her for under $40, I'm a happy girl. There are 6 shades to choose from. Yes, you're not getting a ton of shadow in there, but you're also not getting such an egregiously small amount that it becomes completely useless to even purchase it. And despite my griping about this whole idea of a user-friendly layout, I will say that the pan shape is very user-friendly. I'm not convinced that the layout has anything to do with it, but I do appreciate that I can get a brush in there very easily, pick the product up without running into the other pans inadvertently. So happy with that. The performance aspect is there, which I expected having had previous experience with Pat McGrath. I will say I'm not a mega Pat McGrath fan. I just don't really understand the hype, and that holds true here as well. It's a good palette. It's not life-changing. I certainly wouldn't sit here and say that this is a must-have run, don't walk situation, but if you've been curious about her larger palettes and the thought of paying $174 Canadian or whatever the American equivalent is to that makes you choke, this might be a really good entry point for you because you get to test out some of the different finishes, and it is a very pretty and cohesive color story. I would actually like to see her come out with a few more like this, not necessarily monochromatic, but different color themes that have some complementary shades included in there. Sorry, I got distracted with that one because this little guy has come down to say good night. It's bedtime, isn't it? Yeah.
Wait, are we giant in that?
Not that one, but if I flip it. Oh, now you're upside down in giant. Look. Big Bennett. Ah!
Wait.
Can you wave at the camera and say, be a decent human being?
Be a human.
Be a decent?
Be a decent human being.
Good job.